It was the late autumn morning of 1943, on one of those raw, grey days over the steppe, when the horizon looked like an iron bar hammered flat against the earth. A single Soviet fighter, its olive-green paint scoured by months of dust and freezing wind, skimmed barely 100 feet above the snow-crusted ground north of the Donets River. Inside the cockpit sat a man whose name meant nothing to the outside world at that moment, just another frontline pilot, another young officer holding onto the stick of a fighter that the rest of the world had already dismissed as a failure. His breath crystallized on the inside of the canopy. The engine behind the spinner coughed, steadied, and growled. He nudged the throttle. What he did not know, what nobody knew that morning, was that he and thousands like him were in the process of rewriting the reputation of an aircraft that American engineers, American test pilots, and even many American commanders had come to regard as a design gone wrong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. They said its engine was in the wrong place, its supercharger was inadequate, and its high-altitude performance was worthless. They said the Bell P-39 Airacobra was a machine that belonged in training fields or second-line patrols, not in the crucible of frontline combat. But at low altitude, where the Soviet-German war was truly fought, that same criticized aircraft was becoming something else entirely. The young pilot scanned the white expanse ahead, searching for the faint black dots that Soviet ground observers had reported moments earlier. He tightened his glove on the stick. Somewhere above the haze hung a formation of German aircraft fighters and ground attack machines, heading to strike a Soviet rifle corps, struggling to hang onto a rail junction. Once again, he would be climbing into combat in a rejected American export, written off in Washington, laughed at in some British test reports, and yet, quietly, methodically becoming one of the deadliest killers on the entire Eastern Front. What happened next, and what would unfold over the next 2 years, would overturn nearly every assumption anyone had held about the Airacobra. By the time the war finally staggered to its end, Soviet pilots flying this inferior fighter would claim more than 2,400 aerial victories. They would produce multiple pilots with well over 30 victories apiece, and one who would become the highest-scoring woman fighter ace in history. But none of that was visible on that first cold morning. Not yet. At that moment, all anyone could see was a young lieutenant easing his aircraft into a shallow climb, his breath fogging the glass, his eyes narrowing as the dots ahead resolved into the shapes of Messerschmitts. The world he flew in was one most Americans never saw, and one that few in the West fully understood even decades after the war. The Eastern Front was a continent-sized battlefield running from the Baltic to the Black Sea, where nearly every engagement occurred at low altitude, treetop height, sometimes even lower, where the slipstream kicked up dust and snow. It was a world of ambushes, sudden maneuvers, and vertical ranges measured not in miles but in hundreds of feet. Soviet aviation doctrine, shaped brutally by the reality of German armored spearheads and massed infantry assaults, demanded fighters capable of swift acceleration, tight turning at medium to low altitude, and rugged flight characteristics that allowed pilots to throw aircraft around without fear of structural collapse. American doctrine could not have been more different in those early years. Before 1944, American fighter thinking was dominated by the high-altitude escort mission and the belief that air superiority would be won, in the upper regions of the sky, far above the reach of ground fire and close-range chaos. Engineers in Ohio and New York designed aircraft with turbo superchargers, aiming to fight above 20,000 feet and beyond. What mattered to them was high-altitude climb, deep strategic range, and the ability to guard bomber streams across Europe. Down low, beneath 10,000 feet, where Soviet, German, and later Japanese pilots often lived and died, American test priorities were thin. In this divergence of doctrine lay the heart of the story, and the irony at its center. The Bell P-39 had been built for an environment that never fully materialized for American pilots. Bell engineers had intended the aircraft to fight at high altitude, relying on a turbo supercharger mounted aft in the fuselage. But in 1939, as production demands mounted and the Air Corps sought to simplify the design for rapid manufacturing, the turbo supercharger was removed. The aircraft lost its high-altitude bite. American test pilots noticed immediately. Climb above 15,000 feet? Poor. Acceleration at altitude? Weak. Interception capability against high-flying bombers? Inadequate. The Airacobra seemed to fail every requirement it had been meant to meet. And yet, hidden inside that same aircraft were features that mattered far more on the Eastern Front. A solid center of gravity from its mid-engine layout, superb roll response at low altitude, and an armament no frontline Soviet fighter possessed at the start of the war, a heavy nose-mounted cannon capable of tearing apart armored aircraft and ground vehicles. It was a weapon the Soviets desperately needed, particularly against German bombers and the low-flying Henschel attack aircraft that stalked the front lines. When the first batches of P-39s began arriving in Soviet hands under Lend-Lease, they did not receive them with mockery. They received them with curiosity, and then with something close to gratitude, because the aircraft offered them something no Soviet fighter of the early war truly had: stability in gunnery passes, heavy striking power, and handling characteristics that meshed with the close-range knife fights that defined combat across the steppe. To Soviet eyes, the Airacobra was not a design flaw. It was an opportunity, but that understanding did not yet exist during those first months. The world in 1941 and 1942 was still moving under the weight of assumptions written in doctrine manuals, in Western intelligence reports, in the early combat dispatches from the Pacific. American officers wrote that the Airacobra struggled to perform above 15,000 feet and therefore struggled everywhere. British pilots tested the aircraft and declared it unfit for European air combat. Even some American ground crews, frustrated by maintenance difficulties, believed the aircraft not worth the trouble. What no one in the West realized was that a fighter's value depends entirely on the environment in which it fights. And the Soviet-German war was an environment no Allied test report had prepared for. Below the thin cloud layers that hung over the Don Basin, the Stalingrad corridor, the Kursk region, and the marshes of the Dnieper, fighters rarely climbed above 3,000 feet. They fought in the shadow of artillery smoke, above trenches, vehicle columns, and forests ripped open by rocket blasts. A fighter here was judged not on high-altitude climb but on how quickly it could roll, how well it held energy in a turn, and how stable it remained as the pilot lined up a shot in the space of a heartbeat. The young Airacobra pilot now climbing toward the German formation knew none of the broader debates about doctrine. He did not know what British test boards had written about his aircraft. He did not know that American officers had filed reports describing the Airacobra as a machine for second-line duty. He did not even know that American squadrons in the Pacific had found it unsuited to their needs. All he knew was what his instructors had told him: keep your speed, watch your engine temperatures, trust the cannons in the nose, and never forget that the Germans fight low because they fear the Soviet ground fire. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He continued his climb. The dots ahead grew larger. His breath no longer fogged the canopy. His focus had tightened to a razor's edge. Below him, the front line stretched in a faint, jagged seam trenches, ruined farmhouses, artillery pits, and a scattered line of smoke columns where shells had landed minutes earlier. Then he saw them clearly. A wedge of Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters escorting a group of German ground attack aircraft towards Soviet positions. The German formation held its shape. Their engines glinted in the flat winter light. They had not seen him yet. He pushed the throttle until the engine roared, brought the nose down slightly to build speed, and prepared to strike. He was flying an aircraft the Western world had dismissed. He was about to prove, once again, that every assumption about it was wrong. And behind this moment lay years of engineering decisions, doctrinal misunderstandings, and battlefield necessities that would turn the Airacobra from a rejected American design into one of the most consequential fighters on the Eastern Front. Below the clouds of war, at the altitude where real fighting lived, the Airacobra was about to find the world it had been built for, without anyone realizing it at the time. The German formation cruised forward in a clean, disciplined line, their pilots confident that they controlled the air above the battlefield. For months, the Luftwaffe had operated almost freely over this sector, sweeping down on Soviet frontline troops, with frightening precision, diving through the smoke of artillery strikes to cut apart supply convoys, ammunition trucks, and even fleeing infantry. They expected to see Yakovlev fighters or the occasional Laji somewhere below, but the weather had grounded most Soviet units this morning. That was their assumption. Assumptions had killed more pilots on this front than bullets. The young Soviet lieutenant angled his P-39 downward until his gun sight bracketed the lead Messerschmitt. The German machine was flying slightly higher, maybe 300 feet above him, close enough now that he could see the flash of sunlight on its canopy. He steadied his breathing, just as his instructor had taught him. One long inhale, one slow exhale. Let the engine's vibration settle into a rhythm with the beat of his pulse. He squeezed the trigger. The Airacobra's nose shuddered with the recoil of its M420mm cannon and synchronized 50-caliber machine guns. A streak of fire leapt across the sky. The first shells tore through the German fighter's engine cowling, erupting in a brief burst of flame before the Messerschmitt snapped downward, trailing a twisting ribbon of smoke. The German pilot never saw the attacker. It was over before he could even roll. The lieutenant did not celebrate. There was no time. He rolled hard left, letting the P-39's surprisingly crisp lateral response drag him into a sudden barrel-like motion that kicked his altitude down by 100 feet. Another German fighter flashed past him, overshooting. That pilot alert, experienced, reacted instantly, yanking into a left bank to stay on the Soviet's tail. The Soviet pilot felt the G-force crush his ribs and shoulders. He pulled the stick until the Airacobra's wingtips hummed with the vibration that came just before stall. The German was expecting a vertical climb or a break into a steep turn. But instead, the Airacobra stayed low, clinging to the thin strip of turbulent air just above the frozen fields. At this altitude, the P-39 behaved almost like a different machine, stable, responsive, and brutally direct. Below him, the snow blurred as he skimmed barely 30 feet above the ground. He eased the stick, letting the airplane settle into a shallow right turn. He knew what the German would try next, because they all tried it. They would pull up momentarily to regain distance, then dive back down to force a shot. But that small vertical climb was all the opportunity the Airacobra needed. He waited for it 1 second, 2 seconds, then jerked the stick back and right, flipping the aircraft into a sudden climbing roll that brought his nose up almost directly under the German fighter. For an instant, both fighters rose like twin sparks from a fire, one in pursuit, one pursued. Then the Airacobra's cannon roared again, and the second German fighter spiraled into the haze. That morning's brief engagement ended almost as quickly as it had begun. With 2 fighters gone, the German formation lost its confidence. The remaining escorts tightened their spacing, abandoning their support role to protect themselves. The ground attack aircraft, deprived of cover, turned back west toward German lines. The lieutenant watched them retreat until they were little more than black scratches on the horizon. He checked his fuel, his altitude, his engine temperature. Everything remained in the safe range. He turned home. No one yet understood the significance of such tiny moments, one pilot in one aircraft forcing an entire German formation to abandon its mission. No one recognized these early victories as the warning signs they were. The Airacobra was beginning to reveal itself, not as a failed concept, but as a weapon perfectly tuned to the specific conditions of the Eastern Front. For every Western test report declaring the fighter a disappointment, there was now a growing pile of Soviet combat dispatches describing it as deadly at low altitude, stable in firing passes, and remarkably survivable in sudden violent maneuvers. It did not take long for these impressions to spread among Soviet squadrons. By early 1943, entire regiments were transitioning to the Airacobra, including elite guards units. It was in these regiments, staffed with men hardened by 2 years of brutal combat, that the aircraft found its true home. Unlike inexperienced pilots in the Pacific or Britain, these Soviet aviators had fought in environments where the sky was rarely higher than 1,000 feet, and where engine, reliability, cockpit protection, and gunnery stability mattered more than altitude performance or maximum theoretical climb. The first Soviet ace to adopt the aircraft wholeheartedly was Alexander Pokryshkin, a man who had already carved out a reputation as a thinker and a relentless pilot with a talent for rewriting doctrine. He was one of those rare aviators whose instincts ran ahead of the manuals, someone who understood the psychology of the battlefield as well as the aerodynamics of the aircraft in his hands. When he first climbed into the Airacobra, he grasped immediately what it was capable of. His early impressions were blunt. Excellent roll, deadly in a dive, razor-steady under cannon fire, and perfectly suited for the high-speed slashing attacks he had started developing on his own. It was not a defensive aircraft, it was a machine designed for sudden aggression, but its true brilliance came from its center-mounted engine, which gave the aircraft a stability no other frontline Soviet fighter possessed. Pokryshkin's first Airacobra victories shocked German units that had grown accustomed to facing yaks and lagigs. His maneuvers were sharper, his gunnery more accurate, and his willingness to push the aircraft to the edge far greater than anything they had seen before. German pilots noticed the change immediately. Reports filtered back to command units describing attacks, from a new type of Soviet fighter with unusual agility and unexpectedly heavy armament. The reality was simpler. The Soviets were using an American fighter in a way no American pilot ever had. Pokryshkin eventually developed a series of tactical principles around the aircraft principles that would spread across Soviet fighter regiments. Among them was his famous dictum, "Altitude is speed, speed is life." In the Airacobra, this mantra took on a very specific meaning. Pilots were trained to stay just a few hundred feet above the enemy, diving in with overwhelming force and climbing only long enough to regain energy. Gone were the drawn-out turning fights that Soviet fighters had engaged in early in the war. The Airacobra encouraged speed, surprise, and disciplined aggression. This adaptation did not go unnoticed. By late 1943, Soviet Airacobra regiments were claiming victory after victory, not only against fighters, but also against German ground attack aircraft and bombers. The cannon in the nose delivered devastating fire that could rip through armor plating and fuel tanks in an instant, and the aircraft's stable firing platform allowed pilots to hit targets with a precision they had never enjoyed before. The transformation was profound. It was as if the aircraft itself unlocked a new style of thinking, encouraging pilots to trust momentum, embrace low-altitude combat, and strike with lethal clarity. And this transformation occurred at a moment when the tides of war were beginning to shift. After the Battle of Stalingrad and the subsequent encirclements that crushed the German Sixth Army, Soviet forces were no longer merely resisting, they were advancing. The Red Army's counteroffensive gained tempo, momentum, and confidence, and Soviet air units found themselves increasingly tasked not with desperate defense, but with aggressive air superiority missions. In these missions, the Airacobra excelled. The irony deepened further as the war progressed. Some German units came to fear the squadrons flying this American fighter more than those flying the newest Soviet models. Rumors circulated of a lethal American-designed aircraft that seemed unstoppable at low altitude. In reality, the aircraft was not invincible. It had weaknesses, high-altitude performance remained poor, and the engine could overheat if abused. But these flaws mattered little on this front. What mattered was the ability to deliver sudden, overwhelming force, exactly where the Germans least expected it. Just above the treetops, where the Airacobra held every advantage. The victories accumulated, and among those accumulating them was a young woman who would eventually become a symbol of determination and quiet ferocity in the face of overwhelming odds. Lydia Litviak, flying the same aircraft that Western pilots dismissed as inadequate, she crafted a reputation that would echo down the decades. Her precision, her ability to read the battlefield, and her relentless courage left German pilots stunned. She, too, recognized what the Airacobra offered her. It gave her stability in firing passes, a heavy strike at close range, and handling that matched her instinctive style of combat. By early 1944, Soviet Airacobra units were operating with such cohesion and confidence that they often dominated entire sectors of the front. German units could no longer count on low-altitude freedom. Their ground attack pilots, once used to striking Soviet positions with impunity, now found themselves dodging sudden streaks of cannon fire from a fighter they had been told was obsolete. Even the Luftwaffe's veteran aces found themselves challenged. The Airacobra's speed in a dive allowed Soviet pilots to disengage on their terms, avoiding the attritional turning fights that had cost them so heavily early in the war. German pilots who tried to follow into low-level turns found themselves at the disadvantage. The Airacobra's mid-engine layout allowed it to pivot sharply without losing stability. Its firepower meant that even a fleeting shot could be fatal. Slowly, quietly, and with almost no awareness from the rest of the Allied world, the Airacobra was becoming one of the deadliest fighters of the Eastern Front. Yet even as this transformation unfolded, Western observers remained unaware or unconvinced of what was happening. American pilots continued to fly their Thunderbolts and Mustangs at high altitude. British pilots focused on Spitfire variants. Reports advertising the Airacobra's success in Soviet hands rarely circulated beyond Lend-Lease offices or sparse intelligence briefings. It was almost as though two separate realities existed, one in which the Airacobra was a disappointing second-rate fighter, and another in which it was a tool of decisive, war-shaping effect. And in the end, the second reality would prove far more consequential. By the time the Soviets crossed the Dnieper and pushed into Belarus, Airacobra regiments were racking up enormous tallies. In some units, more than half of all aerial victories were scored by Airacobra pilots. Their names filled Soviet dispatches and citation lists. Their tactics became the foundation of new training programs, and as the front lines surged west, these pilots carried their machines into the skies over Poland, East Prussia, and eventually into the very heart of Germany itself. Pokrishkin, by this time a legend, refused to give up his Airacobra even when newer Soviet fighters became available. His loyalty to the aircraft was not sentiment, it was practicality. He knew what it could do, and he trusted it completely. His victories climbed into the dozens. His unit, flying the same machine, became one of the most decorated in the Soviet Air Force, and behind them followed dozens of other pilots, some famous, some forgotten, but all part of a quiet revolution in aerial warfare. The aircraft the Americans had written off was doing the work of a frontline predator. But the West would not realize the full truth until later, long after the war, long after the Lend-Lease crates had been emptied and the factories had moved on to new designs. Only then would historians begin to piece together how profoundly the Airacobra had served its unexpected masters. Only then would they uncover the records of over 2,400 aerial victories attributed to Soviet Airacobra pilots. Only then would the world understand how deeply the aircraft had shaped the outcome of the air war on the Eastern Front. And it all began with moments like that cold morning above the Donets, when a young lieutenant in a rejected fighter aircraft forced an entire German formation to turn back. That moment was the first chapter in a story of irony, adaptation, and quiet brilliance, one that would transform the Airacobra from an overlooked American experiment into one of the most effective low-altitude killers of the war. It was a transformation no one had predicted, and one no one could deny. It was the transformation of a machine that found its destiny not in the skies it was designed for, but in the skies where war demanded something different. In the months that followed, the Airacobra's reputation within Soviet units grew with a kind of quiet inevitability. Pilots who had once doubted foreign-built machines found themselves defending it with near-religious conviction. Ground crews whose hands were always chapped, cracked, and blackened by oil in the freezing wind came to praise the aircraft's rugged construction, the ease of servicing its mid-mounted engine, and the dependability of its landing gear in the mud-churned fields that passed for airstrips on the front. Every Soviet regiment that received the aircraft repeated the same pattern: skepticism on the first day, respect by the end of the week, and fierce loyalty within the month. German pilots noticed the difference long before Western analysts did. Unit diaries recovered after the war show hints of this emerging fear. One German lieutenant flying Bf 109 G2 seconds noted in his field journal that Soviet fighters, with the cannon in the nose, had become more aggressive than the Yaks, and that they were difficult to shake when they attack from below. Another pilot remarked that these new opponents attack with reckless speed and do not climb after firing. They turn low and disappear. The Soviets were rewriting the air war on their own terms. By the spring of 1944, nearly every Soviet air army operating in the central and southern sectors had at least one regiment equipped with the Airacobra. In some regions, particularly around the crucial approaches to Kursk, and in the marshlands of Belarus, the aircraft dominated the low-altitude battles so thoroughly that German reconnaissance units began advising crews to avoid descending below 500 meters without sufficient escort. That was a level of caution the Luftwaffe had never shown earlier in the war. The Airacobra's presence changed everything. Soviet infantrymen began to recognize the distinct growl of its Allison engine. Tank crews, fighting their way through forests and ruined towns, looked up when they heard that sound, knowing that a dive from an Airacobra often meant relief from the ceaseless German Stuka attacks they had suffered in the early years. Pilots flying the aircraft noticed this shift too. They spoke later of seeing Soviet soldiers wave to them with flags or helmets as they swept low over the front lines. It was an acknowledgement, a wordless admission that the balance of power in the sky was shifting. The Germans felt it as well. Their newly deployed Focke-Wulf 190 fighter bombers, once the terror of Soviet supply lines, found themselves suddenly hunted. The Airacobra could match the Focke-Wulf in acceleration at low altitude and outturn it in certain flight regimes. But its greatest advantage lay in its gun platform. Its concentrated firepower in the nose produced devastating results when striking German aircraft, diving or pulling out of attacks. Where German pilots had once used diving strikes to break free from pursuit, they now found themselves exposed. The Airacobra's pilots learned to anticipate these escape dives, timing their own pitches downward so that the German aircraft would practically fly into their sights. Not every Soviet pilot mastered the aircraft's subtleties, of course. It had quirks. Its mid-engine configuration required a careful hand when entering abrupt vertical maneuvers, and its high-speed compressibility characteristics could trap inexperienced pilots in dives too steep to correct. But those who learned its personality discovered a partner rather than a tool. They spoke of it almost affectionately, as if the machine itself had a kind of temperament, steady under pressure, strong when pushed hard, and forgiving of mistakes that would have killed pilots in other aircraft. Among those who shaped the Aerocobra's legend, Alexander Pokrishkin stood foremost. His fame grew not only because of his aerial victories, but because he transformed his regiment into a kind of laboratory for air combat theory. He insisted that the Aerocobra be flown as it was meant to be, not as the Americans imagined it, but as the war itself demanded. He encouraged independent thinking, aggressive initiative, and disciplined formation tactics built around energy conservation and low-altitude dominance. His regiment's standard attack pattern became known as the Kuban ladder, after the region where his unit honed the method. It was an elegant adaptation to the strengths of the Aerocobra. A series of staggered altitude tiers allowed one group of fighters to pounce, dive, or climb in support of others, creating a cascading sequence of pressure that overwhelmed German formations. The Aerocobra's stability made it ideal for this tactic. Pilots could rapidly change altitude without losing control or visibility, and its acceleration allowed them to shift between tiers fluidly. German pilots, when debriefed after the war, spoke with grudging admiration of this formation. They described it as a trap in the sky and compared it to a set of jaws closing from above and below. One Luftwaffe officer remarked that the Americans did not know what they had built, but the Russians discovered it. If Pokrishkin provided the doctrine, Lydia Litviak provided the symbol. She fought with precision, discipline, and a ferocity that belied her youth. The Aerocobra's cockpit fit her frame perfectly. Its controls responded naturally to her light touch. Her victories shocked German pilots who, steeped in their own prejudices, often refused to believe that a woman could be flying against them. But the wreckage of their aircraft littered the fields all the same. Litviak, who would eventually gain the title of the highest-scoring female fighter ace in history, embodied the war's strange paradox. A young woman flying an American-built plane, fighting over Soviet soil, striking down German aircraft designed by engineers in Bavaria. Her story, like the story of the Aerocobra itself, defied every expectation. More and more German units began reporting the presence of these American Cobras, as they sometimes called them. But even as these reports filtered into Luftwaffe command posts, American analysts remained largely unaware. Combat data from the Eastern Front rarely flowed westward. Barriers of culture, secrecy, and wartime priorities kept the Soviets focused inward. Even when American attachés visited Soviet bases, the hosts seldom disclosed the true performance of their aircraft. They would allow demonstrations, yes, but they kept their advanced tactics and their kill records guarded. It was, after all, still war. The Aerocobra's reputation in the West, therefore, remained largely unchanged. It was still spoken of as a disappointment, a machine that had failed to meet expectations in the Pacific and in British service. American pilots joked about it. British mechanics cursed its maintenance quirks. The aircraft's name did not appear in Western press reports with the same reverence as the Mustang or the Spitfire, but in the East its legend grew. By the summer of 1944, as the Red Army launched Operation Bagration, the massive offensive that shattered German Army Group Center, the Aerocobra played a crucial role in securing Soviet air dominance across the front. German resistance in the sky grew desperate. The Luftwaffe had suffered catastrophic losses in the winter battles and lacked the pilots to replace them. Many new German aviators were rushed to the front with only minimal training, often facing seasoned Soviet Airacobra pilots who had survived years of combat. The results were predictable. Soviet pilots later recalled German aircraft, entering combat zones in tight defensive formations, as if afraid to separate. Others remarked that it became increasingly rare to encounter German pilots attempting bold solo maneuvers. They flew conservatively, carefully, often unwilling to engage, especially at low altitude where they knew the Airacobra excelled. The Soviets took advantage of this hesitancy. They hunted German reconnaissance flights mercilessly, denying the enemy the information needed to coordinate defenses. They escorted Soviet ground attack aircraft deep into occupied territory, shielding them from German interceptors. They swept ahead of advancing Soviet tank armies, clearing the skies before major operations. Their presence became essential, almost taken for granted, like the artillery barrages or the rumble of tank columns. And so the Airacobra's story intertwined itself with the great turning points of the war. It flew over the smoking ruins of Minsk as Soviet forces liberated the city. It flew over the forests of Latvia as the Red Army cut off German forces trapped in the Courland pocket. It flew over the shattered roads of East Prussia, where retreating German columns choked the avenues of escape. It flew over the Vistula and the Oder, escorting Soviet bombers as they struck targets deep inside Germany. And finally, it flew over Berlin's outskirts, hunting the last remnants of the Luftwaffe. Through it all, the aircraft proved something remarkable: that an airplane judged a failure in one environment could become a masterpiece in another. Western assessments eventually changed, but not until long after the war. It was only when historians began combing through Soviet archives in the late 20th century that the full scale of the Airacobra's contribution became clear. The records revealed that more than 2,400 confirmed German aircraft had been shot down by Airacobra pilots on the Eastern Front, a figure unmatched by any other American fighter in Soviet service. This number astonished Western analysts. It forced them to re-evaluate the aircraft's capabilities and the assumptions that had shaped its early use. Why had it failed in Western service? Why had it thrived in Soviet hands? The answers lay not only in doctrine, but in culture. Soviet pilots valued the aircraft's strengths, forgave its weaknesses, and built tactics that played to its natural advantages. They flew it in the environment it was born to dominate, even if no one realized it at the time. In the end, the Airacobra's story became a testament not only to engineering, but to understanding. It proved that the success of a machine depends on the world it inhabits and the people who wield it. It proved that innovation sometimes takes unexpected forms, and it proved that redemption is possible even for a design considered a mistake. But for the pilots who fought in it, the aircraft was not a symbol of irony or a case study in engineering adaptation. It was a tensus, companion, a weapon, and sometimes the only thing standing between them and death. They did not think of it as a rejected American export. They thought of it simply as their fighter, and in their hands it did exactly what a fighter was meant to do. It gave them the power to survive, it gave them the power to strike back, and it gave them the power to win. The young lieutenant who had downed those first 2 German fighters over the snow that morning would later recall that moment not as a turning point in the war, but as a turning point in his own understanding. He realized then that the Airacobra was not what others said it was what he made of it. The aircraft gave him confidence, it gave him purpose, and as he climbed out of the cockpit that morning, frost still clinging to his boots, he knew with certainty that he had found a machine he could trust. Hundreds of Soviet pilots came to feel the same way, and through their skill, their sacrifice, and their unyielding determination, they transformed the Airacobra from a misunderstood experiment into one of the most feared fighters of the Eastern Front. For most of 1942, the P-39 Airacobra lived in two different worlds. In the West, it was a joke, a cautionary tale whispered in flight briefings. In the East, it was quietly becoming a razor in the hands of men who had run out of dull blades. But every reputation, good or bad, has a moment where it either hardens or shatters. For the P-39, that moment came on a frozen morning over the Don River, during a battle so violent that even Soviet archives initially refused to record the kill numbers because no one believed they were real. This is the story of that morning, and the man who turned an inferior fighter into an execution machine. His name was Alexander Pokryshkin. To Western aviation historians, he was a mystery for decades. A few photographs, a few interviews, scattered war notes. To the Luftwaffe, however, he was something else entirely. A curse, a ghost. A man whose kill streak rose so fast that German signals officers once wondered if they were accidentally counting multiple pilots under the same name. Pokryshkin had no patience for bureaucracy, and even less patience for myths. When he first saw the P-39 sitting cold on the airstrip nose cannon removed for maintenance, doors open like the jaws of an unsettled beast, he didn't see an underperforming American fighter. He saw a weapon that nobody else understood, something low, something mean, something built for knife fights rather than dances at high altitude. He had grown up poor in Novosibirsk, fixing bicycles for bread money. He knew machines intimately. He knew that what mattered wasn't what a plane should do on paper. It was what a plane could do when pushed by a pilot with a pulse full of fire. He memorized every nut, bolt, and stress point of the Airacobra. He studied the engine torque like it was scripture. He experimented with throttle bursts so violent that American test pilots would have grounded the plane for safety violations. And then he did something no Allied Air Force encouraged. He made the P-39 fight down low, where the war in the East was always decided. Not in elegant contrails at 25,000 feet, but in mud, smoke, treetop turbulence. The chaotic, sound-punch world where a pilot had half a second to change the outcome of a battle. Pokryshkin understood a secret that Western tacticians missed. The Eastern Front wasn't an air war. It was a ground war, fought in the sky. And to win a ground war, you needed a fighter that struck like a hammer, not a silk rapier. June 6, 1943, south of the Don Bend, a German reconnaissance squad had spotted an unusually high number of Soviet armored columns moving west. This meant only one thing. A counteroffensive was gathering. The Luftwaffe intended to stop it before it started. Before sunrise, they sent a mixed force of Bf 109G 2 seconds and Fo 190A as to sweep the airspace clean. Those planes were the pride of Germany, fast, powerful, and in the right hands, nearly unstoppable. The Soviets scrambled everything they had to intercept. Pokryshkin's squadron lifted off the moment, sirens screamed across the steppe. The P-39 engines barked, coughed, then howled awake the sound of liquid-cooled fury. The air was cold enough to crack skin. Below them, frost still clung to tank hulls. Ahead of them, the Germans were already slicing across the sky in perfect formation, a silver wall advancing through the morning haze. By every Western statistical analysis, this was suicide. The Germans outnumbered them. The Germans were flying faster aircraft. The Germans held the altitude advantage. And yet, as Pokryshkin surveyed the sky, he felt something he rarely admitted later. Calm. Not confidence, not arrogance, just calm. Because he wasn't flying the P-39 as Bell engineers intended. He was flying it as a weapon shaped by necessity, desperation, and months of brutal learning. He keyed his radio and said the phrase his men would remember for the rest of their lives. Attack from below. Hit the second group. I'll take the first. It was the beginning of the most violent 5 minutes of aerial combat many of those pilots would ever experience. Pokrishkin dove a vertical knife-edge descent so fast that his cockpit frame shook. At 200 meters above the tree line, he leveled out. His target was a Bf-109G climbing to intercept. The German pilot saw him late, far too late, because no one expected a Soviet fighter to attack upward at that speed. Pokrishkin pulled the trigger, and this is where the P-39 became lethal in a way the West never appreciated. The 37mm cannon was slow-firing. Yes, its shells dropped significantly at distance. Yes, its recoil was strong enough to nudge the nose. Yes. But at 150 meters, at treetop height, in a head-on angle, it was a guillotine. A single shell hit the Bf-109's engine cowling. A split second later, smoke exploded outward like torn fabric. The German fighter spiraled down, its pilot likely dead before he realized who had killed him. Pokrishkin didn't even watch it hit the ground. He was already climbing again, already hunting, already pushing the Airacobra into maneuvers American instructors would have court-martialed him for. Higher above, Tupolev 192nd were diving on Soviet ground troops, their cannons preparing to carve the advancing tank columns into fire and steel. Pokrishkin banked sharply, nearly sideways, then performed a maneuver he later described only as a climbing half-roll with corrective rudder. No American pilot had ever successfully documented such a move in the P-39. Bell's engineers weren't even sure the airframe was designed to survive it, but Pokrishkin wasn't flying a factory airplane anymore. He was flying a machine fused to his intuition sharpened by the belief that one decisive strike could save hundreds of lives on the ground below. He closed the distance to the first FTU-190. This kill wasn't elegant. It wasn't cinematic. It was brutal. 3 bursts. A wing shredded. Fuel ignited. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.